All right, top exercises / movements for building overhead strength and muscle. I don't know how this came up, but we're going to talk about it today. When I look out on the floor, when people are working out, like when I go to sort of mainstream gyms, we're traveling around, or I talk to people and they're asking me about stuff, very rarely do they ever ask me about how do I get a better overhead push, right? Or press.
Yeah.
It's always like, hey, how do I make my back bigger? Ironically, if you had bigger shoulders, your back would look bigger. But I get a lot of that. It's a lot of squat, and deadlift kind of questions, more of the bigger compound, complex movements, but not a lot of questions about overhead movement. And this came up on another podcast actually that I did with the In Extremis Performance crew. We were talking about the snatch and the clean and jerk and overhead press movements with a specific population that often lacks overhead mobility. And let's just say a lot of times has poor shoulder mechanics due to their jobs and kind of some of the equipment they wear. And so where does the overhead movement show up for them in their workouts? So that's kind of what led me to kind of want to talk about this a little bit, because I want to talk about it more in our realm and what we do here on a regular basis and kind of what we talk about. So anyway, that's where we're at. We have an overhead athlete in the room, or was an overhead athlete for a long time, and is now transitioned to something different. But that's Steven, and he was a pitcher. So when I don't think a lot of people think about sports and overhead athletes in sports unless you're kind of in our realm. But when I think of that, like we've got baseball. Like if you're throwing, you're an overhead athlete. Volleyball, obviously arms overhead a good amount of the time. Even basketball at a little bit of a different level, but for sure arms are overhead there too. Tennis, a lot of basically racket and club sports, you're overhead quite a bit. And then obviously if you're into Olympic lifting, you're overhead a ton, or if you're into strongman type competitions, not powerlifting, but strongman type competitions, you're likely going to be going overhead quite a bit. And in those things, it goes beyond strength and muscle, it goes into power and speed. And then there's the other component that's capacity, but I wanted to talk more specifically about building strength and muscle, because I think that's where most people need to start.
I also wanted to acknowledge the swimmers.
Yeah, that's true. Yep. Left them out. And then God, if there's people with shoulder issues, it's the swimmers.
My
swimmers
wife
and divers.
Oh my gosh. Her shoulders can do things that I didn't know shoulders can do. Like she can get into these positions. My wife was a swimmer her whole life, and a water polo player as well. So she even has a little more strength, I would say, than the average swimmer who didn't play water polo. But I mean, yeah, I remember one time she was in the gym and someone was having her do like a floor as like a Superman raise. And she was lifting all the way up and they're like, oh, maybe not that high. That's a little like, 2 feet behind your body.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought that up. I forgot about that, Cece. I mean, what's your experience been with overhead athletes, particularly swimmers at the athletic training level?
So when I was at the University of Tennessee, I worked with swimming and diving, volleyball, and I also worked with softball for a number of years. So, dealing with the swimmers, they have a lot of range of motion, and so many swimmers had a lot of shoulder issues. And so it was having to go back to making sure that they're mechanically sound when in the weight room when it would come to pulling exercises to give them some stability there.
Yeah. Swimming's a tough one because it's all happening in front, right? There's while we're doing pulling with the arms, there's very little retraction, right? And depression that's going on. In fact, it's mostly elevation as you're taking that arm overhead, and they're just getting a swimmer in the weight room. I mean, like to actually do some strength training, you got to really have a coach that's really on top of it to get people in to do the dry land training, because they spend fucking 6 hours a day in the pool. It's wild how much yardage they end up doing. And obviously that can create issues. So yeah, I'd forgotten about that. Interestingly, we just had a young man who's preparing for the selection process for special operations, who's going to be having to do a lot of swimming in his process, and obviously in his training. And we adopted a program for him from another guy that we've worked with in the past, Jeff Nichols out of Performance First, who's out in Virginia Beach. He's an ex-SEAL, spent a long time, in SOF, and was a strength and conditioning coach before that. And in that program, it's like, we're not going to reinvent the wheel. Let's go straight to Jeff and we'll find out what he's got in terms of a preparation program. And then we can guide this kid through it, which is what we did. It was like, I'm just going to go to the expert on this stuff. And it was really interesting to see how he put in overhead movement into this programming and then some very specific things because of the swimming component. Not that he was trying to mimic what was going on in the pool, but how to build better strength, endurance, and power and speed in the programming that we're spending in the gym outside of what he was doing in the pool, which, by the way, in terms of his preparation, look, if you guys want like selection process programming, Jeff is an outstanding and amazing resource for that. But the things and the way he did it when we started to dissect it, at first we're like, oh my God, there's a lot here. And when we pulled it out, when you kind of separate it as a coach and you start to look at it, it was programmed really smartly. And I say that because I don't know that shoulders get a lot of attention in that sense. Like, again, there's a lot of talk around some of the bigger, more compound movements because of the value that exists there and how dominant they are in most strength training programs. I mean, the squat, the bench, right, and the deadlift, those are going to show up a lot. So what's happening on the shoulder side? So jumping in, let's get past all that and get into it. So overhead movement, you just mentioned, so many people have issues with overhead mechanics. It's a lot of just what's going on with the shoulders. We have talked about that ad nauseum on the show before, so I don't want to break into every little bit of that. But let's talk about building shoulder strength and muscle as it compares or in contrast against a lot of the other things in the body as we put it into a workout program. And I'll jump in just starting off. One of the things that I think people maybe lose sight of is how active the shoulders are in all the other things that you're doing.
Yeah.
And so when we think about things like volume and intensity, programming shoulder work, overhead work into your programming or into your routine needs to be well thought out. We certainly want to be giving it, we'll go back to the adage of giving it the minimal effective dose for the maximum result we're looking for. And so that it has enough time to repair, right, recover beyond baseline so that we can throw another stimulus at it again and get the training effect that we're looking for, which in what we're talking about specifically today is muscle and strength. So how you program overhead work, I think, is important. So we can maybe touch on that a little bit. But I guess where I see it show up is kind of like middle of the week.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Middle of the week, if you started your training cycle or split, on like a Monday, it's usually like a Wednesday or Thursday thought. Sometimes it's getting hit twice during the week, maybe on a day, on like a Tuesday and a Thursday or a Tuesday and a Friday kind of thing. It's kind of like, I think when people think of it, they think of it as like an accessory type movement. And I think that's a problem. And when I say it's a problem, I think it's because the shoulders are so important. I wouldn't be treating it like an accessory.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people throw it in as almost like sometimes on their active recovery day, they think of as when, I'll do my like abs and shoulders. Like that's a super common thing where they're and it maybe not be focused on strength in that. It might be some more like lateral raises, rear delt work, stuff like that. But I think a lot of people just kind of throw it in on the back burner versus actually like putting it as a focus in the program. And I think regardless of what kind of athlete you are, whether you're trying to build strength but if you're trying to build a good physique, like having big shoulders on both the front and the back, like that's a really big component of whether you're a male or female actually too, of how that V-taper looks if you're trying to build muscle. But then, I mean, a lot of, I think for me, like I like these movements like the big three, but I think you versus something where you're pressing overhead, there's just something that feels more almost like primal about it. That just feels very like your ability to do that just shows, I think, a lot. Like I'm almost sometimes more impressed by someone who can overhead press a big amount of weight than someone who can just bench and things like that. So
yeah, I agree. I mean, especially, so there's different ways to apply overhead movement in terms of where your position in space and, are you standing? Are you seated? Are you kneeling? I mean, you could be seated on the floor, seated on a bench, seated on, some other type of platform. Obviously, you could be standing. You could be slightly unstable, like in an offset stance or something like that. So there's a lot of different ways to apply that overhead force. So obviously, we already have gravity, right, that we're working against, and we have our terrain that we're working on, whatever that happens to be. And then, how we're applying the load. Is it cables? Is it a barbell, so our hands fixed to a bar? Is it a dumbbell? Is it kettlebells? Is it, single arm, double? All of that kind of stuff kind of fits in. So When we're looking at building strength, there's a time and place for all those. But I like where you're going with that, because for me, before we start going overhead with lots of load, we have to think about all the things underneath that and what platform are we pushing it from. So you want bigger, stronger shoulders. You need a bigger, stronger body to push from. Thinking about that platform, because basically everything in that chain below the shoulders, which is almost everything minus your neck and your skull, right, is going to need to be functioning, or you're going to want it to be functioning well. So you're going to want that to be big and strong.
So, we're talking about the shoulders, and I want to go a little bit of a different route, and we can come back. But, in order to build bigger, stronger shoulders, I think you need to have a bigger, stronger back before you can have bigger, stronger shoulders. So you need to know how to be able to pull vertically and horizontally first before you can start pressing overhead. And the reason is because if you think about the pulling and from horizontally and vertically, those muscles are what stabilize your shoulder blade when you are pressing overhead. And if you don't have good shoulder blade mechanics or scapular mechanics, you're going to have really poor glenohumeral ball and socket mechanics when you start to go overhead.
And what are the challenges if that's not great?
You're going to have an asynchronous press overhead. You can have some weakness as far as, because you don't have the stability around the shoulder blade, you can end up with some biceps tendonitis. You can end up with some rotator cuff tendonitis. I would say 90% of your glenohumeral ball and socket joint issues is coming from unstable shoulder blade.
Yeah.
And not firing properly, those muscles firing properly to stabilize.
Yeah, like sequencing properly.
Yeah. So I think a lot of things that may inhibit somebody from doing a lot of heavier overhead shoulder work would be overhead/shoulder work, is the fact that they're already feeling a large amount of discomfort from something, which can, I agree with you 100% because I seen it. Most of it has to do, most of the time, with poor shoulder mechanics. They're not set up well, so they have to revisit some things. And so we talked about this, go back about 3 episodes, we talked about building a bigger, stronger back and how to do that and how the shoulders tie in here. And so I think that's a really good point you make, because if you're already starting from a weak platform with poor movement, and everything's rooted in movement here, right? And your ability to move well, right? It doesn't have to be perfect, it's well. Your inability to move well will then obviously translate up the chain or down the chain and could create issues. And those issues just might be weakness in areas you don't need or want weakness. It could be an irritation. It could be an injury. Again, I never like to make this about, don't do this because you'll get hurt. Like I don't like that. However, I will caution you on it because I seen it. Like you may wind up with those things. Now, here's another thing. If you're an athlete, you're somebody that's been super active your whole life, right? And you've been into stuff. Maybe you played contact sports. Maybe it was a non-contact sport or non-contact injury. But so many people have some level of shoulder injury that they've carried with them somewhere that was maybe a little bit more traumatic. I have 2 torn labrums. One, I know very specifically when I did it and how I did it. And the other one, I'm not exactly sure, but I know there were plenty of times where I fell, whether it was on the bike, in a scrap, because I've been in a few of those, on a field. Certainly I've separated my shoulders before on the football field. As big and strong as I was, I wound myself up in a situation where that thing was out and it quickly went back in, and you just kind of move on because you don't want to get pulled out of the game. Right. So those kind of things I think pop up. So I think people can relate to those. But you don't necessarily have had to have an acute injury to have some type of like a labral tear as an example, or some fraying of that biceps tendon, which is largely due probably to poor shoulder mechanics over time. It's just this constant wear and tear. It's like a good analogy would be like the alignment being off on your vehicle. On your car, and you look at the tire wear on your car, and all of a sudden you're looking at it, and it's what my dad would refer to it as cupping, right? Where one side of that tire is really worn down, doesn't have the same tread, to the extent that maybe the belt is starting to the wire belts in there are starting to kind of stick out a little bit. That's poor alignment. It's poor mechanics, right? At its very basic level, and what happens over time is it wears, right? Now you can operate like that for a long time until it can't anymore, right? Something comes up, you hit something, right? You run over something, or you just flat out wear it out. And obviously that could then mean catastrophic problems, right? Yeah. Driving down the freeway and you see the tires coming off of the big rigs or the semis going down the road. That is just, you've worn through the tire cap that they put on those tires or whatever else, and it's gone, outside of it being a blowout.
Yeah, which I love that analogy for, especially something like the shoulder. I feel like, the shoulder is very, very complex in these mechanics that need to go on, that there needs to be this like synergistic movement of and engagement of a lot of the tissue. So that's how I kind of explain a lot of people, like, when they're like, oh, I have a rotator cuff injury. Well, do you really have a rotator cuff injury, or was your rotator cuff maybe doing too much of the work because of your poor shoulder mechanics? So yes, there's time to strengthen the rotator cuff or strengthen the things that help stabilize the shoulder overhead. But what's your scap control look like? What are the other big stabilizers around the shoulder doing? And what does that look like to help you get a more, I guess we'll say, optimal movement pattern that doesn't wear the tread as much as you in the same instance. So it's interesting though, because we've talked about, I think a lot of people have this like injury or this issue or pain. And so a lot of people throw in the towel with going overhead. They avoid it, which that's never going to get you there. And we've talked about, until you have to go grab your luggage when you're on the airplane and you can't get overhead and you have no strength or ability to do that. Like, you need to be able to do that to some capacity, but it's finding the right dosage and the right exercise for you, which that's where working with a coach or really feeling out. But overhead is very relative, right? Even when we were talking through like the athletes overhead, there is a strict standing overhead press, which is in a full, shoulder flexion and extension and thoracic extension and in that position. But then it's a very wide spectrum. So you'll see like in a lot of our programs where we kind of titrate getting you slightly more and more overhead. So maybe you're on like a low incline press, then you go to a higher incline press, and you go to a higher incline press, or you're working with a landmine, or you're working with a kettlebell. And we've talked about some of those different mechanics, but titrating to see where you are still building strength, capacity, and muscle in, but that you don't get these big issues or pain or an inflammatory response every time you do it, things like that.
Yeah, so you have to find the thresholds, and at the same time, if you treat your body like it's a fragile thing, then that's exactly what you're going to be, is a fragile thing. So that's a really good place to kind of jump off from, and that is basically on the overall perspective of stability. And stability comes with proper mechanics and building strength around the thing that you are trying to train. So I always give like the diving board analogy as one of those things. So you got your diving boards attached to the side of the pool, right? So it's got a base on it, and that's cantilevered out over the board's on top, and it's cantilevered out over the pool. And at that base, you've got, let's say, 4 bolts holding it to the pool deck, right? And then you have your platform, and it may have different stiffnesses or lengths or whatever, and that changes the physics and the mechanics, how much flexy and bouncy you have on that thing, right? But that's where your force generation comes from. And so then you get the 150-pound diver on there, or person partying at the pool. They get out there and they bounce and get a little flex in that thing. They spring up into the air and they dive or cannonball or whatever into the pool. Well, that looks a little different. The board looks a little different, right? And the force production is a little different when you get the 250-pound person that's that. And you put the 350-pound person out there, and obviously that's it. That's an issue, or that changes things too, and could be an issue for how the diving board is performing and how stable it needs to be. Yeah. So let's go back to that base with those 4 bolts. Let's say you got one of those bolts that's kind of backing out. Either it's coming out of the concrete, or that nut gets loose on the top, and you have a little wiggling, you have a little wobbling, right? So basically what you have is a little instability. And that instability, going back to the 150, 250, and 350-pound, diver right on there, that's going to create that translates back through the board down into the base, and then down to that very weak spot, and it just starts wearing away. And over time, a couple of things can happen. Maybe what it will do is it'll make those other 3 bolts in that base have to work that much harder, right? And they probably will, and they'll probably do a good job on it until they can't anymore, until that 350-pound diver keeps hitting that board over and over and over, and then maybe one of those other ones starts to back out. Yeah. And I think you see where I'm going with this. Basically, what you're doing is you're getting instability over time. That changes the mechanics of what's going out at the very end of that board where the person is actually bouncing, and it gets translated back, and everything in between is impacted. Also, everything in between gets less force production as there's less stability. Yes, So if you're trying to just pile on load to your overhead shoulder press, and you have points or a point of instability and or lack of strength and poor mechanics, again, the mechanics of the diving board should be rock solid to that pool deck. If it's not, everything else is it's kind of
Could
null
be
and void.
compromised.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
going to be compromised. So if you think about it that way and how you're lifting, you could apply this to all the things, right? But if you think about that, like the stability is the most important place to start. So, and that becomes with building a bigger, stronger body down low and not leaving anything off the table. All right. So moving from there, let's assume our diving board and our diving board platform is strong and stable. And we've done a good job at securing that thing. We read the instructions. We had a professional install it, right? And we've been caring and maintaining for that thing for quite some time. That is our body now, right? All right, so let's talk about, hey, how do you get more height off that diving board, more force production off that diving board, which is really where the strength and muscle is going to be built. How do you do that? Where do you start? Well, you probably didn't get that where you're at without doing anything. So what are the most common ones that we see, like in the gym, or what are most commonly programmed? I think these would be ones that are probably pretty obvious to people. I mean, first one that comes to mind is like, you're always going to see an overhead dumbbell press.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right. So you got two dumbbells, right? They're moving independently of one another, but maybe at the same time. And you sit down on that L seat, right? In the gym. It's nice and comfortable, super stable. Now you create even more stability because you're seated and you're backed up against that back pad. You can push your feet into the floor, drive back into you, and push those dumbbells overhead. Awesome movement for a lot of reasons. If we're trying to, again, just focus on the force production side of things.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good one. And why? Because it's going to impact all those things within the shoulder the way we want it to be impacted. Again, time under tension, like we're loading it, we're taking it to fatigue. The other thing I like about it is if you fail in that one, it's not a big deal, right? You can drop the weights back in front of you. You can quickly pull them down. You can drop them onto your legs or even drop them onto the floor if you had to. So, I mean, that's a real basic one.
Well, I would actually take it the direction now that I like a little bit less, but to go more of the like external stability and time under tension and let's say safety in the movement. A lot of people just go immediately to like a shoulder press on a machine, machine shoulder press, which there's pros and cons to that. It does even more of all those things you were just talking about. It provides even more external stability. It's on a very specific, let's say a bar path or movement path. Because the machine is fixed. Even if you try to change it to your body type a little bit, change the seat height, all that kind of stuff, it's not going to be perfect. So that provides that stability that for a lot of people can get a very good stimulus. But I would argue too that if that's the only pressing you're doing overhead, which there's a lot of people who do that, that's not going to fix those mechanics that we're all talking about. That's not going to, you're not challenging your internal stability at all with that external force, which again, I think as a portion of a program or a time for a program that you're going through that.
Certainly a time and place.
Super easy to just, I'm focusing on working my delts, let's say very simplistically, I'm working my front delts and I'm really going to work that. And that's what I'm pushing for. But if you only ever do that, you're not challenging some of the mechanics, the motor patterns that are very important for this stability around the shoulder, let alone like your ability to stabilize and actually build strength in some of these other tissue. So that's where on that side of things, before I like actually more the other end of the spectrum personally.
I'm confused. You like the machine or you like the dumbbell?
So I actually, where I'm going to go next is I really like a barbell overhead press.
Okay, no, but what you were just saying as far as like on the seated overhead press machine, you like that more so than the dumbbell?
Sorry, I was confusing how my brain works sometimes. I was saying I like the other end. I view the barbell overhead press as the other end of the spectrum and the machine on the other end of the spectrum and the dumbbell overhead press in the middle.
Oh, in the middle.
Oh, I got you.
Yeah. So I took it this way. I turned left even though I actually like turning right.
Okay, got you.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So my take on that would be I actually like the dumbbell overhead press before the machine. And the reason is because the dumbbells, I mean, you can go as light as 3-5 pounds and it's getting it up into that position, abducted position to go overhead. And you're already creating tension and you're working on proprioception within the shoulder joint.
For sure.
And so you can create the tension in your starting position here as you're pressing overhead. Whereas with the machine's not made for every single body type and 100%. Whether you're short or whether you're tall. And then depending on what you put the pin in as far as for the load, you're having to start here in a very tight position as far as not creating
sometimes.
Yeah, depending on the machine. Yeah. But I think as far as for me, I like the dumbbells and teaching people how to use those better just because they do have to incorporate more stability within the whole body and they are creating more stability and proprioception within the shoulders. Yeah. And so they're having to think about it That's just my take.
No, for sure. And I would agree with that actually.
Yeah, I do too. There's no
right or wrong. It's just like,
Oh, I think there's some wrongs, but I think there's a lot of rights, right? And you guys are hitting those. I think there's some wrongs in some cases. It depends on the individual and what you're trying to achieve and, your individual situation. However, I agree with that. Stephen, I just kind of going over to you, we mentioned at the beginning, you were an overhead athlete. I wonder when you were pitching at the NC2A level, like what overhead type movements were being programmed for you, if they even were, when you were an athlete? And I bring that up just for, a lot of people get their programming from what they did a long time ago.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm curious.
Well, I think for one, I think the resistance training for pitchers specifically has gotten so much more advanced, and the type of exercises and movements have become so much more specialized, even in the last 10 years since I played. But and we were really it was pretty basic. It was like, barbell military press, dumbbell overhead press, your standard, raises from, different positions, lateral raise, front raise. And then as far as, for warm-ups or maybe at my school, we actually would do, our coach made us do a dumbbell routine after we pitched, immediately after we pitched, with very light dumbbells. A series of, your kind of your rotator cuff type of movements that you see, your standard movements there, like external rotation, internal rotation. We used to do all of that. And then, the tubing stuff, which was also, external rotation, internal rotation, some type of like flies. Those were coming up often. So now there's like all this different type of equipment. There's like, so it's gotten so much more advanced because there's been a movement towards max velocity. So they're really teaching pitching much differently, even in just 10 years, where it's like maximum force production basically is what they're trying to teach. So now they have all this kind of weird fucking equipment and weird stuff. But it was, kind of like your standard gym bro shoulder exercises, upright rows, stuff like that.
So I think that's interesting because I agree with you and I've seen it happen. And I think we're actually you're seeing the outcomes of this different type of training, and you're seeing it on the athlete and the types of athletes that are standing on the mound, say like in MLB. In years past, what you had was big, tall, lanky humans, like big dudes. I mean, when you start thinking about some of the guys, like
I think Randy Johnson,
Roger Clemens,
Roger Clemens, the Moose. Yeah, I think like Justin Verlander is kind of a guy who's still in the league, who's built like pitchers were in like the 90s, early 2000s. Big tree trunk legs, 6'5", 230 pounds, big dude.
We had Bumgarner here for a long time. Like, dudes is just a beast.
Yeah, like 6'4", 230, 240, yeah.
The point of that is a lot of the guys you're seeing standing on the mound now, like particularly here, like locally, we're watching the Giants players, they look like kids. And I don't mean that like disrespectfully. They're young, but they're small. They're much smaller pitchers than there used to be.
Stature.
Yeah, much smaller. I mean, I'm not saying
throwing much harder than guys of that size used to throw.
That's the point. Go back to the velocity training and how the things have advanced. I don't want to get too far off track here, but the point of that is we are talking about building muscle and strength, right? And so not that these guys don't have any of that, but it's very much focused to how do we get max velocity out of the athlete that we have standing in front of us. And at some point, there may be a point of diminishing returns with how much muscle and strength they actually build. So it's interesting, like you have to think through your goal, like what is it you're really trying to obtain here? Do you really want bigger, stronger shoulders, or are you trying to get more powerful shoulders that allow you to express your strength through speed and velocity? So that's an interesting point. But going back to what you were saying, still the old dumbbell, barbell, military press stuff, machines, when I first started in the high school gyms, all had the universal machines. We didn't have a lot of free weight, but everybody had a universal machine, like a Nautilus machine where you had the overhead shoulder press, which is
I think that's a great one for be able to like add the progressive overload.
Yeah. As old as that machine was, and I think just as people are listening to this and what we were saying, as old as that machine was, you know what that machine had? Like that overhead press was also the bench press. You could adjust the height of that bar.
Oh, interesting.
And you didn't necessarily have a bench to lean up against. You were sitting just on a bench. So you didn't have a back pad or a chest pad. So you had to sit underneath it and press overhead. Yeah. And obviously there's a lot of things people could say about that. But my point of that is it holds up, but the athlete had to adjust, or the lifter had to adjust underneath that thing to make it work for them. Again, that could be good or bad, but those old just overhead press with weight, that works.
Yeah.
Right. But however, to both of your points, when you were going to each end of the spectrum there with the barbell military, the dumbbell overhead, and then the machine fixed press, sort of those are all ends of the spectrum. So there's all these things in between. Bottom line is you should be pressing overhead, like in some way. And just like you apply like loading to your lower extremity with like a squat or a hinge, like a deadlift, there needs to be like a primary overhead lift that you're doing in order to maximize strength, strength, and also muscle building or hypertrophy. So I think like it's fair to say everybody should be pressing overhead. And I say that as a blanket statement. Even if you have some type of limitation or even pathology, it's likely that you can. We just have to find the right movement, the right range, and the right dosage for you in order to build the muscle and strength through there. But what we end up seeing it broken out to is going back to the beginning, is a lot of these more isolated movements like lateral raises with dumbbells or cables or tubing. And we're putting a lot of volume into our workouts, which, you can build hypertrophy there, but the strength is going to be limited. So think about that. Like, do I just want bigger caps on my shoulders, or do I want more shoulder strength? And it's not that if you build muscle, you're building strength. That's not my point. Like, hear me out here. Yeah. But at the same time, if you're building strength is and can be different than building hypertrophy in terms of how you're applying your programming. So it should look and feel very much like you're building strength in your lower extremity or in your bench press or in your seated row or in your deadlift or anything else. It's the same. So again, don't break it out into all these things. And people treat it like they treat their biceps. Like they got 4 different movements that they're doing for their shoulders, like they're doing for their biceps. Like, why do you need 4 movements, 3 sets each? It's like 12 total sets. What are you doing here? Like the shoulders do a lot of things. Mm-hmm. But remember, going back to what we were talking about before, think about this, and that is every time you're pulling or pushing, you're using your shoulders. So how am I applying those same principles, up top when I'm going over it? Okay, so we talked about sort of the basic ones. If I have a limitation with regard to maybe those exercises aren't working for me, I have maybe an injury, I've got an irritation, I've got some type of mechanical issue that's stopping me from doing those, or they're just uncomfortable. I don't feel comfortable. Those are 2 different things. Like I'm not comfortable, like I feel pain, versus I'm not comfortable because I've had injuries in the past and I'm scared I'm going to hurt myself. What are some other ones that you guys like?
I think if most people haven't played with is going to a landmine. That's a super accessible way to get overhead, and we've talked about that on our shoulders episode, where you can change your body position. You can be standing or kneeling, and it does change how much it's overhead and all that kind of stuff. But we've talked a lot about shoulder mechanics, and I think the thing that is great about a landmine is it teaches shoulder mechanics. So it's not only that you're getting overhead, but because you're pressing vertically, but then you're also pressing into the implement. We've talked a little bit about needing to get some serratus anterior engagement, and the shoulder blade needs to come into upward rotation as you press up overhead. It teaches that and it strengthens that while you're also working your normal musculature for pressing overhead, like your delts, things like that. So if you are someone that has shoulder issues, or you're newer, or you just never tried it, like play with the landmine. That's a big one that a lot of people don't do.
Yeah. So to be clear, there's a few different ways to apply the landmine. I don't know if that's where you were about to go.
Yeah, no, I remember, you talked about that in the past, and then you also talked about the Viking press too.
So
which is basically like a bilateral landmine.
Yeah, so exactly. So application would be if you have the landmine would be that tube that sticks in, maybe it's attached to a rack, it's on a swivel or attaches to a plate on the floor. It's got a sleeve on it. You slide that barbell down into it, and it's got lots of motion in it, right? You can do all kinds of things with the landmine. I really like landmine for a lot of reasons. I also think it gets a little overplayed sometimes, but it's a really valuable piece of equipment. And so what I also like about the landmine is how you can create stability below that, going back to teaching somebody how to do the movement properly and learning the mechanics, so that you can then go apply those in other places, again, with the dumbbells, with the barbell, whatever else, as you start to progress. But you could start with somebody standing, getting their whole body involved with it. So that landmine is now basically connected to the floor, if you will. The barbell's coming out towards you. You grab the other end of that barbell, and you can press overhead. It allows you a lot of freedom and flexibility to put it in the place that your body feels comfortable going or has the ability to complete. So you can do it with a single arm. However, there's all kinds of things you could do with it. You could do it from a kneeling position, from a half kneeling position. So if you're having a little bit of trouble keeping that stability, or you really want to load it up and really isolate or focus on that area, you could drop to one knee, you could drop to two knees, right? And so now we're taking everything from the knees down out of it. So you can create that stability from the knees up rather than from the feet up, which is a different feel. And you might recognize like, oh, my range of motion seems to be limited. That's probably because you picked it up somewhere else down the chain.
Yeah.
Take the knees and the ankles out of it, and you might find that you don't have as much range because you've compensated from the ankles, the knees, and the hips, maybe low back, thoracic, to be able to get that a little bit more directly overhead. But if you take those things out of the bottom, you might recognize that, oh, I don't really have that range. I am a little bit more limited here.
For sure.
So that's like the single arm stuff, but you mentioned like the landmine, which I really like too. It's an awesome piece of equipment. Basically, it's that attachment.
Or the Viking.
Sorry. Yeah, the Viking attachment that goes slides right over that end of that barbell. And then you've got handles on either side.
Yeah.
To where now you can do it bilaterally. You can change your widths on there in your grip, and you can load it more, right? Because you can get more weight on that bar. So landmine, Viking press attachments are great ways to overload in maybe a more stable or safe position to get the max benefit out of the work that you're putting in. I love that one too. What else you guys like?
I really like a bent over row and working on the eccentric component, especially when, we're pronated, our palms are facing down. To really hit posterior shoulders, because you're also hitting your back at the same time. So depending on, the load that you're utilizing and the implement that you're using, you can really hit that posterior shoulder well.
Yeah, I love that one. It's probably one that gets left off the list in terms of a shoulder exercise.
Yeah.
People wouldn't think of that.
Yeah, they think rear delts, then they have to go to the pec tech machine and sit backwards in it and do your rear delt exercise. I mean, that's rear delts, right? It's the same. It's the same motion. It's the same mechanics that you'd be doing in the bent over row or barbell row. I talked about my favorite back machine in the gym, and that's that seated plate loaded pull where the chest pad is in front of you and the handles are out in front, and it has the different hand positions. Again, go back a few episodes to how to build a bigger back. We were talking about this, and I specifically mentioned this. You're going to build bigger shoulders and bigger rear delts as you start to get a little wider. You take a little bit more of the lat out of it. You recruit a little bit more of the rear delts to get that bar or that machine or that bar going the direction you want it to. Another great one and that one's super safe, right? Because it's kind of hard to mess that one up. Yet you can really overload and really focus with that machine by taking out. The difference being the bent over row, same movement pattern. We're just in an upright position, stabilized by the machine, versus being bent over, obviously, with the barbell, and that having the rest of the chain having to work quite a bit differently and quite a bit harder to maintain the same stability. Go back to the diving board analogy to really produce that force at the end, which starts at your hands, right, which is attached to the bar and then comes all the way back. But that's a great one. I'm glad you brought up.
Well, there's that. But then also going back to the landmine, doing a single arm bent over pronated row, palms facing down.
I love that. Yeah.
Or whether you're using a dumbbell, you can still use that bent over rowing mechanic with those other modalities.
Great progression or regression, depending on where you are in your journey here. And that one again, highly adjustable, right? So if like the barbell is just not feeling right, or you have some asymmetries, or you have some issues on one side versus the other, you can still overload. And there's the other thing I like about that is it's much easier to work through some of your power movements on that landmine, implement the components of power with the landmine versus like a machine that's fixed. And, maybe it's not as kind if you're dropping it and you're just trying to work that concentric or that concentric movement right from the beginning, that power production right from the dead stop. But that's what I also like about what you said about that bent over row. It still translates over to the other things we talked about. That's the eccentric portion, that lowering portion, which is where we build that hypertrophy. We build that strength. It's in that eccentric motion. That's where most of
the work gets done.
That's where the most of the work is done and the growth happens. Going back to my guy, Jeff Nichols, and what he had programmed into this selection program for people that obviously have to push overhead a lot if you're pushing logs and shit that they do in selection processes, but also the swimming, is how he programmed in tempo and power work throughout the week using some different things, which is really cool. But I like that movement. Both those movements a ton. And the fact that you're hitting, like you're thinking rowing or pulling versus overhead pressing to build a stronger overhead press. Also a good one. One of my friends, Jacob Hepner, was huge into CrossFit for so long, he's still a huge proponent for it. And now in the tactical games, which is a whole different thing, he really, so talking about like, how do you do it? He really likes tempo work for building strength and muscle overhead, particularly on the strength side of things. And just working tempo. So maybe a little bit lighter loads, but really working to that max effort, under tension. We're not talking like 30 reps, but more how you're handling the speed, or that you just mentioned the eccentric portions, things like push presses. When we looking into you can build a ton of muscle and strength through things like push presses, push jerks. If you started to work into, more of the Olympic variants of, the clean and jerk and the snatch and things like that. Those are great exercises or things that you can add in. They're a little bit more advanced. They certainly require a much higher degree of stability, body awareness, and skill. So that's the thing I was gonna say at the end there. You nailed it.
Sorry.
No, it's good.
Jumping.
We're thinking the same, and that is the skill component. So pick the low skill, low risk, high reward, right? Movements first to start. I mean, and I think what you guys said there about, look, there's machines, there's barbells, there's dumbbells. There's one other one that I really like. I'll bring up here in a second if you're challenged with your mechanics. But those are the ones you want to pick at first and get good with those. And then there's regressions. We've talked a little bit about that in order to get there. Before you get into like these more dynamic and higher skilled or movements that require a high level of skill to build that muscle and strength. I know everybody wants to do the sexy shit, but a lot of times, particularly as you're getting in, like you'll see those movements that all the movements we mentioned, like in our Red Dot Strong program. And then as you move into our Max program, and we're focused a little bit more on power and strength, you're going to see a little bit more of the dynamic stuff and some of the things we've talked about. So in terms of implements, like it could be anything. As long as you're loading overhead, you can build muscle and strength. I like an overhead kettlebell press. I like it in a couple ways. I like the standard kettlebell press, and I also like the bottoms up press for creating stability and strength. You mentioned like the rotator cuff and those muscles around there. I like that as a warm up, as kind of like a priming movement. I dare to say, to kind of get everything fired on, like to get things kind of fired on. It also is like, this is what we're doing to prep ourselves moving into the heavier loaded movement. I'm not doing this to failure. I'm just getting in there to kind of feel around, if you will. I've said that before, like in your warm-ups, I'm feeling myself out for the day. Like, again, I just told you, I've got 2 torn labrums. For a while, I took some advice when I damaged the one side, pretty significantly about taking it easy. And I think it was the worst advice I ever got, like, because I really nursed that thing. And it caused me more problems down the line, I think, than good. My point of that being is you still got to load it. You got to go to a certain point. You have to go to that threshold.
Yeah.
You have to give it enough stimulus. So, but one of the things that I learned is like just getting in touch with it and getting everything fired on. Because part of my issue after doing it that way was things switched off. I became weak and I lost mobility in my shoulder at certain points, and it became very apparent very quickly. And so what I kind of turned to, and this was purely anecdotal, but I got into doing more kettlebell overhead pushes, single arm overhead press with the bottoms up. So that's the bell itself is facing the ceiling and it's balanced on top of your hand. So it really also worked grip strength, right? Wrist strength and mechanics, which I'm always been challenged with in terms of extension, but specifically in terms of what it did for me from a warm-up perspective, and what I would use that like later in the week as another movement, and I would go heavy, right? With that heavy for me, which was, like a 30 kilo or 32 kilo dumbbell or a kettlebell. And again, I applied the same principles I applied to any of my strength training with that. And that would be, look, somewhere between 8 and 12 repetitions, right? 2 quote unquote failure, or, 1 to 2 RIR to build that strength. That can be done too. Again, it's a different exercise. I think it gets looked at a little bit differently. I certainly can't do as much with that as I could with like a dumbbell. I could push, let's say, overhead with single arm with like 100-pound dumbbell, but I couldn't do that with 100-pound kettlebell because of the dynamic of the kettlebell. So anyways, another good one, like if you're kind of trying to think outside the box, or I really like training with kettlebells, and that's what I have available to me in my garage. I like those too for building overhead strength because it helps with the stability piece. There's a little bit of an endurance component, I think, that happens there for some of that tissue and some of those muscles in there that we need to have endurance and stability and strength in order to build the things on the outside that we ultimately see and want to see get bigger and get stronger. Anyway, that was kind of a rabbit hole. Anything you guys want to add in terms of building overhead strength?
Man, I need to mention, because my favorite exercise, I think it gets hated on a little bit. We've talked about the ability to like stabilize standing and all that, but I mentioned it slightly, but I love a barbell overhead press. Like when a standing barbell overhead press.
From the rack? Yep.
From the rack. I mean, people talk about like the seated, you get better time under tension and you get that external stability, all that. But like, just every time I implement that into my program, my strength, I feel like across the board shoots up, definitely the size of my shoulders. Like, and it just feels, it's just one of those exercises that when you complete the lift and you can do it like in a good way where you're not overcompensating through other, portions of your body, like it just feels great. I think if you haven't tried it out, like it feels, you should definitely implement that.
I am 100% on board with that. If I'm doing anything with a barbell overhead anymore, it's that exercise.
Yeah.
But when I was younger, and I mean a lot younger, I loved the seated military press.
Yeah.
So all the gyms used to have those. They don't necessarily have those anymore.
Not much anymore. You don't see those very much anymore.
People go to the Smith machine, not the same.
No,
right?
No.
It's sort of the same. It's sort of the same as the landmine in terms of how you're applying force to that bar, because the machine is providing stability, so you can push into the machine, back into the machine, or whatever. So not the same. If you don't believe me, go try to put as much on the military press, barbell military press, as you can on the Smith machine and see what happens.
Oh yeah,
way different. It's like putting 600 pounds on the squat bar and unracking it versus if your squat's 400, your max squat's 400, and taking that off the bar. Like, you're going to find out real quick who you are and where your shoulders are, for sure. And on that topic, military presses, seated military presses, for those people that are doing that, again, with the barbell. There's one other one I might mention here that got a lot of attention for a long time that I'm not a huge fan of, but, and I have my reasons why. But how do you guys feel about pushing behind the neck versus pushing from the chest or in front of the head?
It's interesting. We're always going to say like, it depends on, I think if you can get into a good position, like if you're an Olympic lifter, if you're an overhead athlete, like if you're doing snatches, I think it's a great exercise.
Ideally, yeah, it would be great for you.
Yeah, it'd be great for you because it pulls you in external rotation. But I cannot tell you how many times I see someone trying to do it at the gym and they're like in internal rotation and they're here and it's a very, very high risk, but there can be some reward to it.
Yeah,
but
easy to screw up.
I can tell you, I've never programmed it for a client. I can tell you that.
I haven't either. I can't remember ever doing that either, because they just simply didn't have the shoulder mechanics.
Yeah.
And again, to do it well.
Most people don't have that.
You don't have to be perfect, right? You don't have to be perfect at it. But again, most of us work out in front all day long. We're a little limited there anyway. But if you're one of those athletes or one of those people that has great mechanics, good mobility and all that, sure, do whatever the fuck you want.
Well, if you're an Olympic lifting athlete and you do snatch balance.
Yeah, all the time.
Right? Snatch balance all day. Yeah. So, it makes sense there.
I was just going to say that kind of reminds me of, I think, especially if you're trying to fix your mechanics or build strength and muscle, but you're trying to not just do the basic machine work, a really good principle is always just try to slightly shoot over your head with what's challenging you. So that's an extreme end of like, if you can almost get the behind the neck press, but you're a little bit off of it, that might be a good way to work on your ability to do that. Where if you can't quite, if you're struggling to get overhead, but you're past the landmine, like working with dumbbells where you have to fight to get into a good overhead position. So you're always slightly challenging your ability to do that exercise, not just from a strength standpoint, but from the mechanic and from, all the stability and all the things we talked about as well. So
yeah, one more I want to bring up here. This is the one that I heard, got a lot of attention. There were some guys that I know that really pushed this one, and I'm just not a big fan of it. I'm not saying it's not a good exercise. I'm not a big fan of it because I don't think most people can do it well. And just because you can't do it well, doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing it. And that's the Z press with the barbell. How do you guys feel about the Z press?
I love the Z press.
Yeah, you program that decent amount.
I do. But, we also have barbells of different loads. So it's not necessarily a 20 kilo load. There's with 15, we have a 10. And then we also have like a 7 or a 12 pound aluminum bar. So I think it's really good for posture if the individuals have decent posture.
So
let's talk, hold on before you go.
I think it can also force them into getting some thoracic extension. Yeah.
So what is the Z press? So the Z press is you are seated on the floor, right? So
and you have to be up on your ischial tuberosity, so your butt bones.
So you're seated on the floor. Your legs are supposed to be straight out in front of you, so you should be. Yeah, they can be. Yes, they can be. They can be out. Your feet can be separated outside the hips, way outside the hips, if you want, outside the shoulders. It's fine. You're probably going to need to do that to find that proper posture. So you're seated on the floor, seated upright. So you're basically, let's call it a 90-degree angle at the hips, right? So you're. In order to get there, that in and of itself is a challenge for me, right? I've always been challenged with my hip flexion and spinal extension at the same time. Always, since I was a kid, touching my toes and doing all that stuff was always a real challenge. Some people just bend right over, do it. Since I can remember, since I was 5 years old, and they made us do that, like my first soccer game, or my first soccer practice, where you had to reach over touches. Was like, I can't fucking do this. Like, what's wrong with me?
It just automatically extends.
Right. I just supposed to pop right back out of there. Like, I just was never good at that. So that is what a Z press is, which most of the time means you need to be in front of a rack, right, where the bar is obviously at chest height, where you can unrack it. So you have to have the strength to be able to do that, get the bar off, get it up, underneath your chin, like on the top of your chest there, and then press it straight overhead into this overhead position. For some people listening to this, they're going, yeah, nope. So,
I have caveats, though.
So CC puts that in there in some of the programming. I'm not a huge fan of it because so many people struggle with it. And I'm like, okay, if I only have X amount of days to work with this person and we're really trying to build some overhead strength, right? And build some muscle. Like, is that the one I'm going to pick? Probably not. However, everybody's got their fingers like
but when we program it into our group programming, it's not like we're just doing it one day. There's a build up to it. The other thing is there are caveats to the Z press. So yeah, you can do a barbell. Your Z press is traditionally done with a barbell, but you can do it with dumbbells.
Yeah, we do them with dumbbells and kettlebells.
And the other thing is, like, if you don't have the posture or the mobility to get into that position, you can always put your butt up on like a little 4-inch block. And then gradually, that would be a regression of the exercise, and then gradually move the block down to where you're on the floor.
So and I think how CC programs it a lot, and how I view it is, I do not view it as your overhead strength exercise. So if that is your primary overhead strength exercise,
that was my
I think
point.
you are missing strength gains out on the table. But as an accessory, and if we're thinking of almost like time efficiency to work on some mobility, I view it as more of a mobility exercise of your ability to get into that. And it should maybe be on that, on those off days where you're doing your other shoulder work, or at the end of a workout, if that's your goal to work on that, like, spinal lengthening, hip flexion, all that kind of stuff, and shoulder mobility, that is where it has its merits. But there are a lot of caveats of, can you get into a good position? I think a lot of people butcher it too. But I've never programmed it as a primary strength exercise. I think of it as an ancillary thing. So.
I'm with you on that. That's exactly. It's not that I hate the exercise. I just, again, from a value perspective, what are we doing and what are we trying to achieve? Okay, sorry.
I love that you brought that up.
Sorry, Steven. I thought Steven was going to jump in there with, I hate the Z press, right? You hate it.
I mean, it's a difficult position.
You're on that side of the table.
Yeah,
so
it is. I absolutely understand how it gets butchered so often. Yeah, like a lot of people have a lot of trouble getting into that posture.
Yeah.
I have people raising their hips off the floor most of the time.
Yep.
Yeah.
Some people still want to do it fully seated, and then they're slouching. So that's like, and that's,
I mean,
when you're slouching and doing it, it just looks like painful.
Yeah.
Yeah, we just got to find, again, going back to Ryan says this all the time. We have to find out what we need to do to complement the mechanics that you have in order to get into these positions to do it. So it doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing it if you lack that hip flexion and spinal extension. You can do it. Cece just walked you through that. So if you're finding it in your program that you've maybe gotten from somebody and it's the primary strength movement and you don't have it, maybe move to more of the standing overhead press or the seated overhead press versus the Z press. Love the movement for the reasons that you said, not as a primary strength builder. I think as a primary strength builder for a lot of people, or for a population, it's going to be a very small percent of the population. Particularly when you look at, like, most of the people we work with are desk sitters.
Yeah, seating.
They're seated.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's the majority of people these days. I mean, just look around. It just, technology has kind of taken us there. But it's not that if you sit at a desk, you shouldn't or can't do this. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying most of our people are just in that seated, forward flexed, hip flex position all day long, knees bent or knees flexed. So, just getting there is a challenge. I know it is for me. Like I said, it kind of always has been. And I'll also say this, going back to what you're saying about mobility, and then we'll kind of wrap this up. Mobility is very important for overhead strength and muscle building. And again, we talked about all the things that are happening on the bottom side of the chain and the rest of that chain built below the shoulders. And we've talked a lot about mobility on the show and different things that you can do to increase mobility in all different areas of your body so that you have better full body mobility. And to your point, that is an awesome way to hit so many things at one time, to then set yourself up for more overhead, strength and muscle building. So think about it that way. You want a good mobility exercise? Fucking that Z press is a pretty solid exercise to be choosing. So anyway, hopefully what this did was just give people a little bit better kind of insight to how they're approaching their overhead strength, the different things that are there. We talked about some basics. We talked about some things you could program in between. Not necessarily the exercises maybe, but how you're applying the exercises and kind of what you're feeling through. The other thing that I would suggest to people as we wrap this up is that, a lot of times we do see the bilateral movement happening the majority of the time. Single arm movements are awesome for working around things, but also challenging those maybe, again, I'll use the term asymmetries, if you will, asynchronous movements type things where things aren't really working well together. Again, I'll go back to like that bottoms up kettlebell press that I was doing. Like, obviously on my damaged side, it was much weaker for a long time, but now, and that was my dominant side, my right side. Now I can do way more on my right side than I can on my left side. And when I say way more, to me, even if it's a few percent, that's a vast difference for me. So think about that when you're going into your shoulder training, just like you do maybe anything else, or maybe you're not doing any single arm, single leg, isolateral type of movement. Program that in, because you can build a tremendous amount of strength there. Even when we start going into the tempo movements or, some of the more power movements and things like that, which is a little bit beyond this conversation, the single arm movements are a great way to work with, through, and around some challenges or some limitations that you might have. Anyways, go out, hit your shoulders, train them like you train everything else, be smart about it, but understand that the shoulders don't work in isolation. They work with everything else, and everything else got to be cool. And when everything else is cool, you'll watch your strength and your muscle mass go up top.